Hi there, my name is Oli Jungirius and I'm your host of our second episode of BeamReach and Beyond. This episode is dedicated to the healthcare industry. And joining us today is brilliant Ricky Somal, who is the Deputy Director of Organisational Development at Portsmouth Hospitals University NHS Trust, who will share his rich experience of working in the healthcare industry for more than 15 years. In this episode, we discuss the benefits of education and health promotion through the lens of inclusion for both health practitioners and patients, the impact of aging population on long-term health conditions, how ethnic background might impact your genetic predisposition, and the importance of having a representative workforce that reflects a local population. Let's dive into this conversation. All right. Welcome, everyone. Ricky, would you like to introduce yourself? What do you do? What is diversity inclusion? How did you get into that? And what do you do in your daily tasks?
Thank you so much. Great to be here. And thank you for inviting me. So my name's Ricky, and I am Deputy Director of Organisational Development at Portsmouth Hospitals University NHS Trust. And I've worked, started off in the private sector, but then ventured into healthcare 17 years ago. And in my role in organizational development, I have a number of responsibilities. So first and foremost, around employee health and well-being and occupational health, leadership and talent development. And that looks at the whole realm of identification, development, and management of talent within the organization, employee engagement and experience, organizational values and culture. And although it's not formally part of my remit here at Portsmouth, but equality, diversity, inclusion, and a sense of belonging has been a very, very important part of my professional career and something I've always been interested in. So for me, looking at the whole lens of equality, diversity, and inclusion is to separate the three elements. And what does that relate to the employee engagement, the employee experience, but also tackling unlawful discrimination in the workplace, fostering good relations, and eliminating unlawful discrimination at any level of the organization. So they're the kind of the key elements of my role as of today.
It's also very diverse responsibilities and very diverse spectrum that you're working on. Is it something that was perpetuated and accelerated by COVID-19, that it's a lot more need for that, or that has been something for years and years before that?
Yes. So in the UK particularly, there's very strong legislation via the Equality Act 2010, which harmonizes all equality legislation into one act. And we have 9 protected characteristics that prevent us or safeguard people from any form of unlawful discrimination, victimization, bullying, or harassment in the workplace or in society. Now, I think for me, the critical elements when looking from a healthcare perspective, so not unique to the National Health Service in the UK, but more widely across healthcare, inclusion, equality, diversity can be summarized in for me, 4 key objectives. The first one is around better health outcomes for all. So how do we address health inequalities within the workplace, but then also in our communities as well? And that could look at physical health, mental health, and healthy lifestyles. The second element is around improving the best customer experience or the best patient experience. And how do we engage and involve our communities in the design, delivery, and evaluation of healthcare services? And the involvement piece is critical here because we have to treat our patients and our communities as the experts in their care so that we can then identify what we do well, what do we need to improve. So they're 2 customer-facing, patient-facing objectives. And when it comes to equality and diversity and inclusion from a workforce perspective, I think it's about engaging, involving, and inspiring our workforce. And it's also about compassionate and inclusive leadership at all levels of the organization. And I think that's the opportunity there where I think is incredibly important post-COVID. How do we inspire compassionate and inclusive leadership at every level of the organization, but particularly for healthcare leaders at any level, what does that actually mean? And how do you measure and monitor compassionate and inclusive leadership? So they're the four, I would say, more strategic priorities that a healthcare organization should focus on when it comes to equality, diversity, and inclusion.
That's incredibly interesting. Thank you for mentioning that. I didn't realize how many stakeholders you have. They're all different. They have different needs. They have different expectations. And what you mentioned particularly, I find very interesting, to provide better healthcare. So because healthcare is for everyone, it's not a specific niche as it is in the corporate world. When you have a specific niche, specific demographic, healthcare is for everyone in their different nationalities, different age, different expectation. Why is diverse representation in the healthcare among practitioners is so important to be able to provide a better healthcare for patients? What kind of role do cultural differences play, and other aspects of that?
That's you're absolutely right. And again, if you look at the protected characteristics that you and I and people hold, if you look at it first first and foremost in terms of age. So in the UK and what we're seeing across Europe is an aging population, an aging workforce. And with an aging population, evidence shows us that the prevalence of long-term conditions is increasing. So when you have the prevalence of long-term conditions and mental health conditions in an older population, that then creates greater need and demand for healthcare services. So understanding what health data shows us is incredibly important. Then you can apply that wider. So you look at age as a contributing factor in terms of long-term conditions with an aging population. You can look at disability. And we know, whether it be in the UK or in Europe or across the world, people with disabilities experience poorer health outcomes. And also the access to health services is also made more difficult as well. So again, it's understanding and educating the workforce around how we engage, involve, and support the healthcare needs of people with disabilities in the workplace and in our communities. Then you also have the factor of race and ethnic background. So just personally speaking, my granddad emigrated to the UK in 1950. My parents were born in England, as I was born in England. But because of my ethnic origin, I am at a higher prevalence rate to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And that is because of my ethnic background being of Indian origin. So if you're of Indian origin, you are more likely to acquire 6 times more likely in the UK to acquire type 2 diabetes. And that is because of genetic and hereditary factors, but also lifestyle factors. So if I don't look after myself, because I'm genetically predisposed, then I am increasing my risk to cardiovascular disease and COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, as well as other physical health conditions. So again, that's where education, health promotion, and targeted engagement, which is through the lens of inclusion, to raise that education and awareness in communities right across our populations. Then you could also then apply that to sexual orientation. You could apply that to religion. You could apply that to a number of factors around protected characteristics that impact. What I'd also add to there, Ola, is the impact of deprivation and inequalities within society. So we know, whether it be the UK or in Europe or wider, that areas of high deprivation or lower socioeconomic status also have experiences of worse health inequalities. So again, you'll see prevalence of smoking, substance misuse, alcohol, homelessness, poverty, fuel poverty, impacting on people in our communities. So something that we're seeing in winter pressures, what we call winter pressures, is the negative impact of winter on the older population. And we also have something called fuel poverty, where people, because of the cost of living crisis, are unable to heat their homes or put food on the table here in the UK as well. And that negatively impacts on our people in our communities. So the whole inequality agenda just elevates, not just in terms of individual demographic profile, but then the factors that are happening in our society as well.
That's incredibly interesting. And it literally means don't treat how you want to be treated, because that's assumption that everyone is the same, assumption that I don't see color, I don't see age, I don't see all the things. It's very ignorant and does not really work. So it seems that you have a lot of education both for practitioners as well as the patients to actually realize what is the best solution for them, what is best for different diverse populations at all levels of organization, all levels of society. So there seem to be. So are there? What kind of initiatives do you usually have? Is it a lot of education? Can you provide maybe some examples?
Sure, and I think you made a really good point again, and an awareness on this issue, because when you look at the individualized approach, so quite often I always ask people, define equality, define diversity, and quite often people say, well, equality is about treating everybody the same. It's not about treating everybody the same, because you and I are very, very different, and as your colleagues who you work with, people in society, we all have individual differences. So equality is about having equal opportunity, and diversity is recognizing individual differences. And that's why the two are intertwined. In terms of initiatives, I do look at equality, diversity, and inclusion as separate concepts, intertwined, connected, but different. So if I'm looking at equality from a workforce perspective, I'm looking at equal opportunity in attraction of talent into the business, looking at values-based recruitment, looking at learning development and career development opportunities. So people have clarity around how and where they can progress. Now, we do have inequality in healthcare, because if you're from a minority ethnic background, or you are disabled, or you are from an LGBT plus background, here in the UK, in the National Health Service, you're more likely to experience bullying and harassment and less likely to develop and progress into senior positions. You can also apply that to women in the workplace, which more globally, the Women on Boards program is to address the lack of representation of females and women in executive positions across the private and public sector. So we know the problem that exists from an equality perspective. So the way we tackle that is to, one, is to build insight by undertaking audits into the performance of the organization through the lens of equality, diversity, inclusion, and more wider around access to learning and development opportunities. And that will be one of my biggest tips to people, is to understand where the organization is. What is your baseline? So you can identify good practice, but you can also identify your improvement priorities. And by taking a data-led approach through audit, it creates a baseline from which you can then measure performance improvement. The second element I would add is the engagement on involvement of employees, treating our people as the experts that they are. So we can identify either through employee experience initiatives, surveys, engagement sessions, focus groups, taking a multi-methods approach of engagement to build a reliable and valid data set. Because then you can look at what our people are saying and then in turn build better support improvement priorities. Let me give you an example of that. So in my organization, during 2023, I held monthly executive-led sessions called Your Voice with the rest of the organization. So we focused on compassionate and inclusive leadership. We had a conversation with our people. How would they define it? What does it mean to them? What are we doing well? What do we need to do better? We looked at feeling recognized and valued. We looked at having a voice that counts. We looked at team working and working together as one team across the wider organization. We looked at flexible working. We looked at staff engagement and we looked at morale. So we held 7 big conversations in the organization. And by involving our equality networks within the organization, we are able to build that inclusivity into those conversations. So there's a structured format of having the audit, having engagement, strong and effective in the organization. But the critical bit for me, Ola, is taking one big action from those conversations, as you said, we did, opportunity, and then building trust and confidence back into the organization.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very actionable. It's very, in a way, on one hand, very similar to what a lot of corporates, a lot of startups and scale-ups do in terms of, okay, lots of engagement, lots of conversations, yada, 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 but usually it stops there. I really like the way you take more holistic approach instead of assuming, okay, we have a problem here, let's fix it, let's have a bit of awareness and just end it there. But let's look at where we are at. Let's look at the priorities. Let's look at action points and tackle them step by step. There seems to be a lot of conversation. And for me, healthcare workers have always been heroes, if I'm really honest, because it's definitely the sector that it's not easy. It's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of mental health. And it's also in terms of hours and in terms of importance in the impact that you make. So definitely takes a lot of engagement. You have to be 150% there all the time. Because if you look some tech companies, if you take a day off, that's fine. No one will ever notice. The impact is very low, but in the healthcare, it's a completely different story. So it's beautiful to hear that you acknowledge that and also give an opportunity for your people to feel acknowledged and to address the issues of mental health, to address the issues of the importance and also engagement. That's really, really beautiful to hear.
And you're absolutely right. And just, you just got me thinking where the challenge on people working anywhere in healthcare is profound, particularly post-COVID, and the impact of nursing shortages, and that's global. The impact of nursing shortages is actually a global situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which would then give us the business case quite strongly for the importance of inclusion, because people need to feel a sense of belonging to their organization, their team, and to their colleagues. And people know working in health, they're going to have a tough day, but it's that sense of belonging that gives people the get up and go and looking forward to coming into work. People have to enjoy work. And we spend so much of our time at work in the workplace. There has to be that sense of job satisfaction and motivation, morale at the end of it. But I think what I really like from what you just touched upon is the health and well-being piece, because when you look at health and well-being, it has to be more holistic now. It can't be the simple occupational health referrals, whether it looks at mental health, physical health, or healthy lifestyles. For me, they're the organizational interventions within the organization. For me, there's also the organizational enablers to positive health and well-being, which looks at culture and leadership. It looks at feeling supported and valued by your line manager, because that is a critical element of how you feel happy at work and motivated at your work, is your relationship with your manager. Quite often, people don't leave jobs, they leave their line manager.
Yeah.
So all the importance of compassionate, inclusive leadership is that reflective practice into the organization that I feel inspired by my line manager, and I see clarity. I have clarity on my career development and progression in the organization. So culture and leadership, line management, communications, engagement are all cultural elements of positive health and well-being in the workplace.
Yeah, definitely what you also mentioned in terms of shortage of nursing stuff. It's I found a very interesting concept. Recently I read an article in US. There's I don't know whether it's the same in UK as well, traveling nurses, and they're freelancers and they travel between states simply because there are just not enough of people, and they have a contract for a month, for two, and then move on to a different state or a different hospital just to be able to support that demand. Sometimes it's seasonal, sometimes it's, I don't know, the reason is.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we see that in the UK as well. So we have something called winter pressures. So we know post-COVID has changed the healthcare landscape quite considerably. So we know at certain points, particularly around winter, when the weather deteriorates, this will have a negative impact on people's health and well-being. And particularly if you look at more wider elements around homelessness is a particular issue. All these are elements that impact on people when you look at more holistic individual factors around health and well-being. So again, it's a incredibly important factor that you raise.
Do you see any change when it comes to diverse representation at all different levels of organization post-Brexit and post-Ukrainian? I mean, unfortunately, it's still there, but since the war started in Ukraine, because of staff, nationalities and needs, and, there are lots of refugees coming, as well as a lot less opportunities for Europeans to get a job in UK. Do you see any difference?
Well, not so much in healthcare. So again, we have, the business environment is across clinical and corporate roles. And just within my own organization here at Portsmouth, we're 8,500 employees. And 27% is from a minority ethnic background. So that is higher than our local population that live in our local population in terms of ethnic background. So the importance of establishing ourselves as an inclusive employer is incredibly important. And the international employment is an important part of our role. So has there been a shift in COVID since COVID-19 and particularly around Brexit? Absolutely, it has. However, it's in our international workforce are a very, very important part of our workforce who bring in incredible skill and experiences and only enriches our organization. And what we do well through our equality, diversity and inclusion team is the celebration of cultures within the organization. So on a weekly and monthly basis, there's lots of education and awareness that goes around to celebrate all of our cultures in the organization. And that builds a sense of belonging and a sense of team spirit, which I think is really nice.
It's just a lot nicer also than just having 3-hour cultural differences training on a Friday afternoon. And then that's just those are the do's and those are the don'ts. But rather than having a conversation, celebrating this, focusing on similarities rather than differences, as usually happens in a corporate world, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a 5-step model to this, whether you look in healthcare, not just for patients and communities, people who access healthcare services, but then also for our people working in the organization. That 5-step model, firstly, is keeping people safe. So safe is the first objective. We've got to keep our people safe when they come, either as people working in our organization or people accessing our services. So in healthcare, we want to deliver excellence for our people every day. And that's through the provision of high quality, caring, compassionate and inclusive services. The second element is caring. So we are safe, we are caring. And that's where compassion, that's where inclusivity, that's where values-led organizations come to the fore. Then there's responsiveness. The definition of responsiveness is respond to individual need. So you understand the needs assessment, the audit approach of understanding what your people want in the organization or what they need to have an optimal staff experience, people experience. Then also to your customers, whether that be patients, internal, external customers, in terms of their needs and expectations, managing those expectations. Then it's effectiveness. So we know we're safe, we know we're caring, we know we're responsive. Then how do we monitor and measure how effective we are? And again, that's through the audit process, it's through employee engagement processes, it's through surveys, employee viewpoint services, engagement, focus groups to understand how we involve people and respond to their improvement priorities. And then the 5th element is well-led. So under a well-led organization or an architecture of being well-led is culture, organizational culture. It's leadership, it's engagement, it's involvement, it's motivation, it's morale. Those 6 elements then create a well-led organization. And then organizations can self-assess of where they are in that journey and then what they need to do to improve. So safe, caring, responsive, effective, well-led is a nice 5-step model to look at.
It's very interesting. It also seems to be a lot of things that people need to learn when they just join your organization, isn't it? So onboarding and all those things, especially for staff that it's in the field, so to say. How do you even manage to balance all the things when we have patients, doctors need to run tests, lab needs to do something? How do you even manage to take all these things into consideration when you just join?
So for me, again, it's a great question. So I think that I'd answer that in two ways. One, I think there has to be an organizational response to inclusivity, equality, diversity, inclusion, organizational culture development, our values, particularly. So there's an organizational offer in place that runs throughout the whole employee life cycle. I think that the layer below that is your more localized engagement. So you got the organizational response, but then I would say you go down the next layer down to the divisional. So within your divisional business units, what does the structure of inclusivity and culture and values look like there? I would then take it down another layer to team level, and then I'll take it down another layer to individual level. So there is absolute clarity from an individual person, people perspective, a team perspective, a divisional perspective, and an organizational perspective of what the golden thread of inclusivity looks like. And once you start to establish that golden thread, that anchor sets into the organization, because then people have clarity of what they can expect, not only from the organization, but from the division, from the service, but then from each other as well. And one of the things that works well for me is delivering team development. So team away days, which is culture and values led. So I deliver a number of team developments and team away days with services, with teams to look at their cultural dynamics, their cultural connections within the team. What does a high performing team look like? And then in the afternoon, we look at service transformation. But our people co-design their service improvement priorities. So people then feel invested, involved, and included in business performance. And that's just one day. So the beauty of having that time out with the team brings people together, but then also involves them around their service improvement priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think that I started working recently with a bunch of healthcare organizations that are manufacturing. For example, they produce different types of equipment. And we started having very interesting conversations because in the beginning, they were like, well, why do we need that inclusive, diverse, We work in a factory. Literally, we produce equipment. And then I really started thinking, okay, actually, last week we had someone new join and then realized that her hands are way too small. So she cannot use any of the equipment. So if you're a surgeon, if you're a female surgeon, most of the equipment they produce, it's very biased. So it's not really designed. And also started thinking about the amount of bias there is when it comes to diagnose, how many people are underdiagnosed, for them not being so to say default of the population, and also the amount of medicines that it's incredible. I just read a story in a way that a lot of the medicines for women that are specifically for women are just tested on men. So you're not safe to take them because there hasn't been any statistical evidence that actually good for you make any difference. And it's incredible how it's still happening in the world today. We see the default that you look in a very particular way, but there is no proof that it actually helps you. And it's scary to see that in healthcare, it's the same. So it's really nice that you are taking proactive action to acknowledge that and eliminate the biases and blind spots.
Yeah. And I think my personal reflection is we live in an unequal society, and we will ultimately work in unequal workplaces. And for me, we have to demonstrate, and this is very, very important from a legality perspective, eliminating unlawful discrimination is very difficult to do because it's saying we need to eliminate, as human beings, our own biases. Now, you and I will have our biases. No matter how inclusive we are, you and I will have. I openly admit it. Yeah. I've worked in equality, diversity, inclusion for a very, very long time, but I'm a human being.
Yeah.
Making generalizations and stereotypes is part of your brain chemistry. So we take in up to 11 million pieces of information, And our brain chemistry then has to make sense of all that information.
Mm.
And it does it by grouping lots of information together. And that's where it starts to generalize information, stereotype information. But then that's the danger, where generalizations can lead to stereotypes. Stereotypes can then lead to prejudice. Prejudice can then lead to discrimination.
Yeah.
And what I would say to people is it's very difficult to completely eliminate that.
Mm.
What we have to demonstrate is due regard to eliminate unlawful discrimination. Now, that's an individual responsibility that you and I will hold, because we can then self-reflect to say, why did I behave in that situation? Or why do I feel indifferent to this person? What is it about a group of people that I am not connecting positively with? And it's that self-reflection to think, right, okay, I need to have a coaching conversation here because I've reflected that maybe my behavior could have been better in some shape or form. And then I think you're going to apply that to the workplace as well, which is why diversity, the learning and development element is so critical, because bias training or equality, diversity, inclusion training or values training is incredibly important, because it gives people an opportunity to think about how their actions and behavior could impact negatively on someone, because that's demonstrating due regard. So normally people will say, Ricky, I would never discriminate against anybody or hold any biases towards anybody. I find that difficult because we're human beings. We may not purposefully be nasty or bully or harass, intimidate, victimize someone. I know you and I wouldn't do that. That's not in our nature. But it's always good for self-reflection to think, where can I improve? And if I was presented in a situation that impacted on me, then I've got to have that demonstration of due regard. So my big advice to people is to link in with people like yourselves, because you're very talented at what you do, Ola, and you can help organizations understand the science and the psychology behind the art and the science behind discrimination, the art and science between bullying and harassment, victimization, and employee engagement, the art and science of employee engagement, because you look at it through the lens of the employee journey: attraction, recruitment, onboarding, learning and development, and retention. Because quite often people will leave our organizations because they don't have a sense of belonging. They have an opportunity for learning, development, progression in another organization, but you're investing in that talent. So if people have clarity of where their career could take them, they're more likely to stay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting how many parallels I see with the typical, office environment, so to say, but at the same time, it's a lot more holistic. It's a lot more strategic, so to say, for both organization and for talent retention. And I find it very interesting also when it comes to diverse representation, because you need to be a mirror of the society. Do you have any specifics? Because I know some organizations decide to have, we want to have 30% of women in the leadership. You want to have 50-50 representation here and there, or you want to have that many nationalities. Do you have any initiatives like that when it comes to quotas? Because I know a lot of people are not fan of quotas. There are some organizations that see that as the main priority. What is your experience for that?
So in healthcare in the UK, again, it's a very, very good question. So for me, there's two elements how I would answer that question. So are we representative of our local population is the first element. The second element is the every leadership layer of our organization representative. So do we have a representative workforce at all levels? So in healthcare in the UK, 80% of the total NHS workforce, approximately 80%, is female. So we are a female majority workforce. So in its totality, we have 1.6 million employees in healthcare, in the National Health Service, and 80% are female. So naturally, I would like to see 80% at every level, leadership level of the organization. But we know that there is a underrepresentation of women in the most senior levels of the NHS, of healthcare, of organizations. And you could apply that to across the private sector, public sector, globally as well. So some of the initiatives, so whilst we have a requirement to meet a representative workforce, I think for me, it's what are the mechanisms to enable that to happen. And for me, flexible working is important, and creating a culture of flexible working. I think it's also a culture of learning, education, and development. And it's also a culture of eliminating bias within the recruitment process. So there's not one action that's going to enable this to happen. It's more holistic and it's more far-reaching. It's a number of factors that we need to address. And in more specific, in answer to your question, we do have something called the gender pay gap. So every year we report the gender pay gap within our organization. And the action plan to address the gender pay gap is then monitored at our organizational board at the executive level. So then there's clarity of how we're developing and progressing to reduce the gender pay gap within our own organization. So in answer to your question, is there quotas or should we set targets around having X number or X percentage, whether it be females, ethnic minorities, disabled staff or LGBT plus staff in organizations? My answer would be we want a representative workforce. And sometimes it's quite difficult to think of a number. What is a target? But I would always say, is it representative of your local community? Is it representative of your local organization? Would probably be a more sensible way of addressing inequality.
Yeah, and that's also the way I try at least to communicate to private sector, that you need to understand your clients. If you don't have anyone, if you have just a minority of your workforce that reflects your client population, it's very likely that you're not going to understand them. You're not going to understand their needs. You're not going to serve them, or especially if your sector and your industry, it's very diverse. Yeah, you don't particularly serve a very niche population, then you're just simply going to make a lot of mistakes and just a lot of assumptions, and you're not going to create it and the product that you actually need. That makes me think also, I worked once with a couple of gaming companies, and what they told me, and first I was very surprised because I had no experience in gaming at all. And once they started losing market share. They started moving market share to German organization, and we started investigating what is happening. And they realized that they are characters in the games, very stereotypical. So it's bulky, tough guys, and they're lead characters. They're women who are just secondary characters. They don't really you can't really even select them. They're just there to, beautiful bodies and whatever not. And that's it. So it's just a secondary character. So it was very, very stereotypical. And when we look at the competition of the main competitors, global competitors, realize that their characters have very different body type. They have disabilities. They have different personalities. Both genders are represented, also some non-binary characters. And you see that the population, the clients, could see themselves in these characters. So they're actually opting in for different, for their competitors, because they could not see themselves represented in those games. So they didn't want to use these games. And that's why they had to work very hard with designers and game designers and actually creative directors to tackle that. Otherwise, you're just going to be obsolete. No one really otherwise, you just serve a very particular niche and missing out on a massive chunk of a market.
And that's it. There's a business objective to this as well. And I think for me, first and foremost, if you go back to the model I used, caring was the second element. And that's incredibly important because you want to be seen, I would hope, the objective of any organization, private or public, is providing a service to customers or providing a service to patients who access healthcare services. So if you are seen as a caring, nurturing, compassionate organization, then you create a sense of belonging and an affiliation with your customers as well. So it's incredibly important that you look at it through that lens as well, because there will naturally be a business objective around diversity and inclusion. But I think when I try to dissect it, for me, compassionate culture, compassionate leadership, and inclusive leadership, diversity and equality are 4 critical elements.
Mm-hmm.
But my recommendation to all organizations is to focus on what the vision and the values are, because that's how you create a clear sense of belonging. Otherwise, there's a danger of a cognitive dissonance between my own personal values and the values of my organization. And if that grows further apart, then I wouldn't recommend the organization as a place to work. I wouldn't recommend it as a place for care and treatment in a healthcare environment or products in the private sector. So that sense of belonging is incredibly important to look at. Advocacy. Do you feel you're an ambassador of your organization? Involvement. Are you involved in the big decisions, critical decisions the organization is making? And motivation. Do you feel motivated, enthusiastic, and have the get up and go as a vested interest in the team, in the service, and in the organization? So advocacy, involvement, and motivation are 3 very, very important cultural indicators.
Mm-hmm. That also creates a lot of loyalty, isn't it? So you stay for such a long time in an organization, which is not exactly the reality in tech industry. When you think about it, if you stay there for 2-3 years, that's already good, because it's so super competitive. And I think it's even more important for tech to develop this loyalty. Otherwise, you just have massive staff turnover, and especially now with the war for talent, people move on very quickly if they're not happy.
And that's it. The retention of people is incredibly important, because there is lots of opportunities out there in the private and public sector. Other than the danger is losing that talent that you've recruited, developed, nurtured in your own organization. And I think it's a pity. I think it's a shame if people leave the organizations because they don't feel valued, supported, engaged, and they don't feel cared for. That's tough to take, I think. So for me, people, don't get me wrong, there'll be bumps along the road. But if we get that culture right around compassionate and inclusive leadership, and it's very clear to everybody, not just managers, because managers have tremendous responsibilities in organizations. I think it's everybody's responsibility. But those in leadership and management positions have an extra duty, a duty of care to your people, because your team members will look up to you. But then I always believe you have the power to leave a memorable impact on somebody. And for me, I want that memorable impact to be a positive one, because somebody might just need our help. It's very tough in the business environment. Is also very tough in society at this moment in time with everything that's going on. And if you create that caring, nurturing, compassionate relationship with somebody, it's very likely that they will come to you if they need help and support. And I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, and you could see a lot more companies having the silent quitting very quickly without saying anything, because there is no psychological safety. They dismissed one comment, they dismissed another comment, they pretended they didn't hear this joke, or they felt left out once, twice, 3 times, and then they just quit because they don't have either space to bring it up, or they don't feel comfortable to even have this tough conversation.
And that's the importance, I think, of thinking of it more holistically through inclusion. It's about caring for people. So every organization, healthcare or private sector, public or private, will have organizational values. And I always say to people, are those values laminated and stuck on a wall, or do we live them every single day in our actions? So for me, it's important to live the values, not laminate them.
Yeah, and it seems to be many organizations are running a sprint rather than a marathon. It's very interesting what you mentioned also regarding inclusive leadership. I'm also a little bit confused about inclusive leadership. I love the concept, and I was trying to reflect what is sitting with me about this concept, inclusive leadership. And I realized that I just don't like the term inclusive leadership, because I just hope to live up to the day where we have just leadership that it already has inclusive elements and not have to separate those 2 concepts.
It's a valid challenge. And I think, unfortunately, again, when you think of what's happening in society and what can happen in workplaces, the prevalence of bullying, harassment, intimidation, victimization, violence, and aggression is there. There will be examples of that. So again, I think sometimes going back to basics is important. So a number of leadership programs will focus on compassionate, inclusive leadership. So within the UK, within the National Health Service, and we have something called the People Promise, and it's the leadership way. And compassionate and inclusive leadership is one of the fundamental building blocks of culture in healthcare at this moment in time. So again, the importance of having those conversations around what it means, I think, can only be a good thing, because it's a timely reminder to people of our expectations of how we want our people to behave and support and look after their team members. And it's unfortunate that we have to remind people of that, but that's the situation that we're in. But I think it sets the standard for me of what our expectations are.
I like to talk about cultural differences when it comes to communication among patients, staff members that you have. I read an interesting article a few years back that said that how important it is to understand cultural differences when you work in healthcare. I can't exactly remember the particular cultures, but it basically said for specific cultures, when you unfortunately have to announce that someone has a very serious diagnosis, that it's very severe, for some cultures, you want to hear it yourself first, and for the person. For others, you want to tell it to the family first, and the family going to tell the person themselves. So it's quite a bit of a difference. And already taking those nuances into account, that means that you have to be aware of a lot of things. So what role do cultural differences play? Are there any particular representation of specific cultures that are more represented at NHS? And how do you navigate those differences?
It's a good question. And I think first and foremost, I always ask organizations to define culture or define cultural differences. What does it actually mean to the organization? And then at the very top of the organization, your most senior structure, your executive board, or your stakeholders, etc. What does culture mean to you? And I think and then take that every layer down to team level and individual level, because then you start to get an understanding of what the organization understands or how it defines culture and cultural differences. Secondly, I think I'm happy to be challenged on this. I think the vision and values of the organization sets the tone for the organization, because that should influence culture, because vision and values are there for a particular reason that gives me clarity around how the organization expects me to behave when I come into work. Mm-hmm. And if it's that of caring, nurturing, compassion, inclusivity, kindness, and valuing people, then I've got an understanding of what my expectations are in how I deliver my role every single day. And from the private sector, I think that comes down to customer service. What is the impact of customer service on culture or influencing culture in the workplace? I would always go back, though, in terms of culture, is around engagement. How engaged and involved do people feel in the organization, regardless of their cultural background? So don't get me wrong, people will have different needs at an individual team level of how they want to be engaged. And I'll share some of that diversity with you. So I have team members who want their objectives, and I won't see them for 3 months because I just want to crack on and get on with it. I have other team members who I need to check in on a daily basis because that's what they need. They need an arm around the shoulder. But that's, for me, what I would call customer service and building insight. So as a leader, I build insight into the needs of my team, regardless of their ethnic origin, their background or religious background, their sexual orientation, their age, their disability status, etc. That is important to them in terms of their individual differences. And then I can look at reasonable adjustments as a leader of how do I adjust my leadership style to help people flourish, thrive at work. So whereas one person will be, Ricky, thank you for the objectives. I'm going to go smash those objectives and I'll see you in 3 months' time. But I know where you are and I'll come to you if I come into difficulties. Great. let's just check in. Other people need a more closer arm around the shoulder to make sure they're okay. That's totally fine. So again, you build insight into the needs of your customers. So even my team members, I would see them as a customer because they're getting or expecting a service from me. I've got to make sure my customer service is outstanding to my direct reports and to my wider team members. So the cultural differences piece for me goes back to building insight into the needs of your people. And it goes back full circle to what we discussed earlier is around audit, the importance of undertaking audits at a local, at a divisional and organizational level, because you can understand the culture of the organization. And if it's linked to the organizational values, that then is the glue that binds everybody together. Because otherwise it can be complicated if you're looking at a culture change program, but you're not attaching it to what really matters either in the employee experience surveys, your employee viewpoint surveys, or the vision and values of the organization. It all has to be connected because then you have a true picture of the employee journey.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I really like what you said about not really focusing on national culture, just looking what is the person in front of you and how can I adjust my leadership style? Because it's not really about my leadership style. It's not about how I believe feedback should be given, how people should be motivated and whatever not. You think about, okay, what does a person need? What does a person need? So I'm like, what kind of key do I need to get out of my toolbox to open the person's heart, so to say, and open the engagement instead of, okay, what do I have in my toolbox that I think will fit? Because it's my favorite key, whatever not. Yeah, and that makes me think also of I live in Berlin, so unfortunately, as much as the German healthcare is absolutely fantastic, but when you make an appointment with a doctor just to do like a regular checkup, it takes 3 to 6 months just to go to GP. And then sometimes when you arrive, you already feel the atmosphere. You made an appointment, you arrive at a reception. Staff is always different every single time. They're not friendly. They're stressed out. Then you sit down in the hall and then you wait for an hour after your appointment was meant to be. And then you arrive and then nurses or doctors just spend 10 minutes checking you, not really acknowledging you, just doing the basic things. And then you leave after 2 hours thinking that, yeah, I don't want to come back. I want to make sure that next time I go somewhere else. It makes me think that it's difficult because healthcare around the world, it's a lot of pressure. So I respect people a lot who work in healthcare because looking at the enormous stress, enormous hours they have to work. At the same time, it's difficult to solve. It's not their fault on one hand that there's not enough. They probably one person works for 3 people. At the same time, makes me feel that I'm not acknowledged and it's not there. And you don't even know whether they acknowledge your differences, right? When it comes to culture, when it comes to your needs. I'm quite direct if I need something related to healthcare, but not everyone will be as inquisitive and it's extroverted and it's confident to actually ask a question. So it makes me think that this problem they have around the world in healthcare, it's also, as you mentioned in the very beginning, it's just not enough of people. And it's very difficult also to make time. If you have to work for 2-3 people, it's very, very difficult to make time and additional effort to provide the best service ever. And if on top of all, your organization does not give you this sense of acknowledgement, you don't even want to make an effort, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think that in summary and in conclusion is the importance of defining what compassionate, inclusive leadership looks like and what diversity and equality looks like to the organization, but then also embedding it through a values-led culture program. Because again, I think my worry would be if you go to any organization, one of the first questions I would always ask employees is, or their people is, what are the organizational values? Do they know it? And which is a big question in itself. And if people cannot articulate or know what the organizational values are, that's a big problem for me, because that's the glue that binds us together. That's the expectation we set that gives us the standard of how we are going to care and look after each other and our customers and our patients, etc. So for me, that's one of the questions I'd pose to anybody listening today on this podcast is the next 10 people you come across in your workplace, ask them what the organizational values are, and then assess, have a reflection around where they will be able to articulate that answer. It's a good starting point, I think.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And probably as the last question for you, what is the initiative or idea or vision that already either happened that you're the most proud of when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion NHS, or maybe your sort of say favorite exciting project that you feel going to make a lot of impact, or just something that you find fun? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think something that I found particularly useful is, I'll give you two examples. So the first example is working with senior executive level people within organizations to embed a culture of inclusivity, but to dissect that across some different cultural elements. So the first one is building trust. So how do we build trust in the organization? And in my previous organization, which we are now in partnership with, the Isle of Wight NHS Trust, the CEO at that time and I led a culture conversation right across the organization. So we set the standard of how do we build trust and psychological safety in the organization, creating a culture where people feel confident and not victimized for raising concerns. Secondly, having a conversation with our chief people officer or director of human resources around inclusive leadership. In healthcare, working with the chief nurse around, or the director of nursing and midwifery around compassionate leadership. Working with the director of communications around inclusive communications within the workplace. And the fifth element with the medical director around respect and values in the workplace. So building trust, inclusive leadership, compassionate leadership, inclusive communications, and respect and values. 5 big conversations in the organization at the very start, which set the tone and the expectation of the most senior leaders of this organization. So that 1 hour conversation once a month for 5 months started to build trust and confidence in the organization. And within a 2-year period, we saw significant improvements in culture, in employee engagement, and how people are feeling positively about the organization. And that was measured tangibly through our employee experience surveys. So I think that was probably the most proudest. There was more wider elements than that, but that for me set the tone to the organization that this is a serious conversation and we want to improve and listen to our people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Especially, it's fantastic the way you measure that and use data for that. And also that you don't really, have one conversation, expect results straight away. It's a long-term vision. It makes me also think that if heroes of healthcare, who works in healthcare, have time to have these conversations, that I'm sure organization and tech and corporate will also need to find time for that and not really see it as nice to have. But no, we don't have time for that now. We're raising another round or we're launching a new product. Yeah, well, if people who save lives and take care of healthcare have time, then I'm sure companies can do it as well. Thank you so much for being here today. It was a beautiful conversation, lots of very interesting insights, and it's wonderful to learn from you. Thank you.
No problem. It's so great to be here.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback, recommendations, or would like to be a speaker in our next episode, reach out via hi@BeamReach-inclusion.com. Also, if you need our expertise with diversity inclusion training, would like us to conduct a comprehensive audit, or need a helping hand with DI strategy, don't be shy and get in touch. Stay tuned, and until the next episode.